April 14th, 1865, Friday. I had retired to bed about 10:30 and was just getting asleep when Mrs. Wells, my wife, said someone was at our door. I arose at once and raised a window when my messenger, James Smith, called to me that Mr. Lincoln, the President, had been shot, and said Secretary Seward and his son, Assistant Secretary Frederick Seward, were assassinated. James was much alarmed and excited. I told him his story was very incoherent and improbable, that he was associating men who were not together and liable to attack at the same time. Where, I inquired, was the President shot? James said he was at Ford's Theater on 10th Street. Well, I said, Secretary Seward is an invalid in bed in his house yonder on 15th Street. James said he had been there, stopped in at the house to make inquiry before alarming me. I immediately dressed myself and went directly to Mr. Seward's without stopping. Hurrying forward into 15th Street, I found it pretty full of people, especially near the residence of Secretary Seward. Entering the house, I found the lower hall and office full of persons, all anxiously inquiring what truth there was in the horrible rumors afloat. I replied that my object was to ascertain the facts. I hastily asked what truth there was in the story that an assassin or assassins had entered the house and assaulted the secretary. They said it was true, and that Mr. Frederick was also badly injured. They wished me to go up, but no others. I asked for the secretary's room, and as I entered, Dr. Verdi and I think 2 others were there. The bed was saturated with blood. The secretary was lying on his back, the upper part of his head covered by a cloth, which extended down over his eyes. His mouth was open, the lower jaw dropping down. I exchanged a few whispered words with Dr. V. Secretary Stanton, who came after but almost simultaneously with me, made inquiries in a louder tone till admonished by a word from one of the physicians. We almost immediately withdrew, and as we descended the stairs I asked Stanton what he had heard in regard to the President that was reliable. He said the President was shot at Ford's Theater, that he had seen a man who was present and witnessed the occurrence. Then I said, let us go immediately there. He said that was his intention and asked me, if I had not a carriage, to go with him. I said we were wasting time, and pressing through the crowd, entered the carriage. Stanton, as soon as he had seated himself, turned around, rose partly, and said the carriage was not his. I said this was no objection. At this moment Major Eckert rode up on horseback beside the carriage and protested vehemently against Stanton's going on to 10th Street. Said he had just come from there, that there were thousands of people of all sorts there, and he considered it very unsafe for the Secretary of War to expose himself. I replied that I knew not where we would be more safe, and that the duty of both of us was to attend the President immediately. Stanton concurred. When we entered that street, we found it pretty closely packed. The President had been carried across the street from the theater to the house of a Mr. Peterson. We entered by ascending a flight of steps above the basement and passing through a long hall to the rear, where the President lay extended on a bed, breathing heavily. I inquired of Dr. H. as I entered the true condition of the President. He replied the President was dead to all intents, although he might live 3 hours or perhaps longer. A giant sufferer lay extended diagonally across the bed, which was not long enough for him. His slow, full respiration lifted the clothes with each breath that he took. His features were calm and striking. I had never seen them appear to better advantage than for the first hour, perhaps, that I was there. After that his right eye began to swell, and that part of his face became discolored. A double guard was stationed at the door and on the sidewalk to repress the crowd, which was, of course, highly excited and anxious. The room was small and overcrowded. The surgeons and members of the cabinet were as many as should have been in the room, and there were many more, and the hall and other rooms in the front or main house were full. About once an hour Mrs. Lincoln would repair to the bedside of her dying husband, and with lamentation and tears remain until overcome by emotion. The night was dark, cloudy, and damp, and about 6 it began to rain. I remained in the room until then without sitting or leaving, listening to the heavy groans and witnessing the wasting life of the good and great man who was expiring before me. About 6 a.m. I experienced a feeling of faintness and took a short walk in the open air. It was a dark and gloomy morning, and rain set in before I returned to the house. Large groups of people were gathered, all anxious and solicitous. Some inquired into the condition of the President. Intense grief was on every countenance when I replied that the President could survive but a short time.
find out more about 1865, go to 1865podcast.com or find us on Facebook and Twitter at 1865podcast. And if you're a fan of the show, please consider supporting us. Become a patron at patreon.com/1865podcast. "1865